Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where it is you're tuning in from today. My name's Amanda, and I'm the Managing Director here at Stage 32. And I wanted to welcome you to today's Stage 32 Next Level webinar. And today we're going to be talking about the overview of film financing. And we're going to be talking about films under $10 million. And I'm really, really excited because we have like a triple threat in front of us today. I'm excited to welcome back Elsa Ramo. For those of you who don't know Elsa, she is the founder of Ramo Law. She is one of the most prolific attorneys and one of the most prolific entertainment firms in the industry. And she's brought with her two of her team members. She has Zev Robin and Sean Pope, who are just excellent attorneys as well. So we're going to be going through the overview of everything you need to know if you're going to be raising financing for a film in the upper six figures all the way up to $10 million. And one of my favorite things about today is they're going to be doing a mock closing call, which I think you guys are going to find so, so cool. And guys, before we get started, just to let you know, this is live and interactive. So we're going to be opening up for some questions at the end of today. So before we get started, I just want to teach everybody how to utilize the control panel. If you guys can do me a favor and open up the questions box in the control panel. And if you guys don't mind typing in where you're tuning in from today. So what city or what state or what country, that would be great so we have an idea of who is going to be in the room. All right, cool. Looks like people are starting to type in. And then guys, just to let you know, they're going to go over a ton of information. So if you feel like you need to go back and reference anything, don't worry. I'm going to record this and I'm going to put a copy of it inside your Stage 32 profile. So you have it privately and you can go ahead and view it in about 24 hours when you're logged into your profile under education, and then you'll click on my education. All right, guys, so before we get started, just to let you know, I'm seeing a lot of people from the US here. We've got California, LA, Philadelphia, Beverly Hills, Atlanta, Ohio, Chicago, New York, Burbank, more LA. Is there anybody here outside? Oh, good. Okay, there's someone here from London. Anybody else here from out of the country? Fullerton. Wow, this is actually the first time I've had a webinar with only one person that's outside of the US. But just so you guys know that there probably will be people tuning in outside of the US once they watch it on demand. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it on over to you, Elsa. Go ahead and take it away. I'll be here the whole time if you need me, and have fun, guys.
Great. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for hopefully enjoying your lunch or some sort of off time to get yourself educated and equipped. I am Elsa Ramo, and I think all of you can see my screen. Amanda, that's right? My screen is shared at this point.
Yep, we can see it perfectly.
Perfect, great. So basically today is a very basic foundational understanding of film financing 101. And what I don't want to make light of is that while we're covering very basic fundamentals, they're important and integral to really ensuring the success of being able to raise equity financing or financing for a feature film and make it. And one thing that it's sort of a building block class in the sense that we're going to first talk about the structure of the entity that you would use to raise the money, and then how you can bring in debt financing. And then we're going to kind of bring it to modern day or the status quo, which is, even with all the basic and fundamentals aside, we are, Zev, Sean, and I, on the daily, living in a world in which we're trying to get a film financed, knowing that there's a pandemic occurring. So in our closing call, we'll focus more on the current status quo of, even if you have everything going for you, you have a motivated financier, you have a feature film, you have the perfect production plan ever, how do you still navigate that right now? So that will be more on the closing call side of things. So let's get started. Just trying to see how to click my pages. Hold on. Oh, here we go. So the way that we're going to break this down is we'll kind of do a very basic introduction. I'm going to have Sean explain to you the basics of equity financing, and then we'll kind of put it into context of who, what, where, and why. And you'll see as we go through. And the point of that is that in order to think about film financing, it's a collaborative effort. You are going to engage with producing partners, financiers, lawyers, but the reality is that whoever you are in the construct of that, you need to have an understanding of the basics of, who is financing, what are they doing in it, where is the money coming from, how's it being used, and what are the motivations. And each project has its unique sort of set of fact patterns that lead to that. And so it's really important sometimes before you jump knee deep in and you're circulating term sheets and PPMs and using a lot of words that you think are really important, to take a step back and understand a bird's eye point of view of what you're doing. We're then going to talk about a closing checklist on a call. And for those of you who have done that before or not, a closing call is generally sort of the forum, right, of when all the parties group together and talk about how do we make all these pieces come together. And generally they're used when you have a debt financier involved, and it's driven by a checklist that they create that the producers, others, distributors, sales agents all have to adhere to and sign off on before funding commences. And these calls are very important. And a lot of my clients that are producers sort of baptism by fire, just jumped in doing their first or second closing. And you kind of learn a lot by attending these closing checklist calls, because you kind of see that different parties have different agendas and motivations for what they ask or what they raise, and they can go on forever. And it's important to understand from your point of view what the goal is of that. So the mock call will kind of be a way to refresh everything that we've gone over in the past hour, but also kind of put it into context. So you're like, oh, that's what they mean when they say this or that or the other. I'm going to try to leave about 15 minutes for questions. I think we're slated until about 2:30 today. So please send in your questions as we move along. Amanda does a great job of moderating all of that towards the end. So we'll do our best to kind of get to that. And if Amanda, if you feel like within any section, anything is popping up worth raising, please feel free to interrupt us. We're always happy to do so if needed. So let's start with talking about equity. I'm going to have Sean kind of walk you through what everybody takes as simplistic, which is I need to set up a company, and kind of explain why that's such an important foundation and how do you really approach film financing. And so Sean, if you're ready, can I go to the next slide and I'll kind of hand it off to you for a couple slides?
You can.
Great.
Hello, everyone. So we're going to be talking about equity financing, kind of the very base level of financing. Some people say the easiest way of financing, which we'll get into in Elsa's section on who, what, where, when, and why. But kind of from the 30,000-foot view, what all producers typically will do for a project is when they're when they're starting a project out, they form what's called a single purpose vehicle. Most of the time, that's going to be an LLC, although sometimes it's a corporation, and it depends on the state that you're in and what kind of tax credits you're seeking as to what type of entity you're going to set up. But for the sake of right now in this space, we're going to talk about an LLC, a limited liability company. And a lot of producers say, why can't I just make it and have my name on all the contracts? Number one, the first reason is that you don't want to necessarily take on the liability of anything going wrong, a breach of contract, someone getting injured on set, wherein you would be personally liable for any kind of claim that's made against the film. A limited liability company, for the most part, and there are certain caveats to that, for the most part, protects you and protects the other individuals and the investors from any claims that might arise from the production to the exploitation of the project. So we're forming a single purpose vehicle. The next question we typically get is, well, why can't I just make all, I have a loan out corporation or I have my production company corporation. Why can't I just form, make all my movies under one entity? And one is because we're going to be seeking financing that might be different on a film to film basis. And two, again, we're going back to that liability aspect. If I have all my films that are contained within one corporation, kind of one holding cell, if there's a claim made against one film, there might be the possibility of third parties, when they make claims, being able to attach those claims to other property that I own, which is why we tend to silo each film within its own specific LLC, so that we have, if we have 3 or 4 films under our production company, each LLC contains one film. The other reason is because of our financing purposes. At the end of the day, once the film is made and being exploited, that LLC typically has one piece of property that it owns, which is the copyright into the film itself, and the screenplay and any other rights that it might contain, but it's all contained within that one LLC. And that's what equity investors are investing in. They're investing and owning a piece of this LLC that holds the copyright to the film. So, we've hit the first question, why do I need to form one? What type of entity should I form? The third one, which has the typical lawyer answer of it depends, is what state do I form it? A lot of people, if you're based in California, will say, well, I'm just going to form it in California. That's okay if you're shooting here. However, there are certain states, for instance, if you're shooting in Louisiana or Georgia or New York, wherein you're seeking a tax credit, those states typically require that the entity that is seeking the tax credit is formed within their state. So that's the number one consideration of where are you shooting. That will definitely play a part as to where you're going to be forming your LLC. The other considerations are if you're shooting partially in California and partially in a state like Louisiana, typically you might have to register your California LLC in whatever states you're shooting in as well, in order to avail yourself of the benefits of the courts and lawsuits and contract law within those states. Typically that comes up more like a docu-series point of view, where they're shooting in multiple states. Typically for features, it is normally more so just than centered in one state. What information do I need to form my entity? So the first one is what's going to be the name of your entity. That's relatively easy to choose. The other information is if you're forming it in a state like California or New York, you're going to need to have a principal address within that state. So if I'm forming in California and I live in California and my office is here in California, that's relatively easy. But let's say you're a producer in California and you're going to be shooting this film in Georgia, and you don't have an address there, you're just going there to shoot and then turning around and coming back home. There are companies that will allow you to use their address for a fixed amount of money. They're called corporate vendors, and they allow you to at least have an address within that state that you're going to be required to have when you form that entity. The next very important issue, which we're going to touch on the next slide as well, is what is going to be the kind of controls process of my LLC? Meaning, am I going to have a manager managed LLC or a member managed LLC? So this typically comes up in my calls with people when they're forming entities, and they say, what's a member and what's a manager? And at the very base level, a manager is someone that controls the day-to-day aspects, whether they be creative, financial, business decisions of the LLC itself. So normally it's the top, the top producers that are forming the project, and those people are going to be the ones that manage everything that happens in the LLC. Equity financiers are typically not managers. They're typically members of the LLC. So a member is just anyone else that is a part of that LLC, that controls an equity interest in that LLC, owns a piece of that LLC, but doesn't necessarily, unless their operating agreement, which we'll get to in a minute, says so, doesn't necessarily have any vote or say over kind of material business or creative decisions. So with that, the only other thing that you typically will need to have for an LLC is a registered agent, which is someone that, in the event that there's a claim made against your LLC, that's where a lawsuit would go to. Normally, it would be the same address as your principal address. It can be your lawyer, like we serve as registered agent in California for a lot of our entities. It could be the corporate vendor that you hire in the state that you're not in to be your registered agent as well. That's really all you need to form an LLC. I would say the only other thing to consider before you're forming, and this kind of plays also into what state do I form in, is you always want to discuss your formation with your accountant, whether that's your, that's your personal accountant if you're a manager or an equity financier, but also with your production accountant as to if what are the taxable implications for forming in one state versus another. Does it make more sense to form in Delaware if I'm shooting in New York, because New York has kind of a two-entity system that we typically set up, but what are the best taxable implications for where I'm forming my entity? So that's always a consideration you should always discuss with your accountant before you go and form your entity. Next, what is an operating agreement? So an operating agreement is basically the governing documents that manage everything about an LLC. So you kind of think of it as like the Constitution and the book of rules that govern everything that happens within the LLC. So that says, like, if there are multiple managers, how do we determine if, Zeb is one manager, I'm the other manager, and we disagree, and I really want this one song in the film, and he says, no, that can't be the song in the main titles. How do we clear up that issue? Well, our operating agreement is going to say, like, whether I have the tiebreaker vote, whether Zeb does, whether Elsa, our third party that's not a part of this LLC, has control over that. It's going to lay out, what happens, what the managers are responsible for, and then most importantly, from an equity financing standpoint, it's going to lay out, as monies roll in from the exploitation of my project, how are those monies divvied out, and what is the allocation of those monies? So that is what we typically call a waterfall. It can come from typically gross receipts of the film. So once my film's complete, I shot it in California. I got all equity financing to make my film, and now I have a distributor and they're distributing it, and now I have money coming in. Well, how does that money get distributed? So Elsa, if you'll click on the next slide for me. Normally we have like a sample waterfall, but I'll go through kind of what a standard typical waterfall typically looks like. And we'll get more into this in the closing checklist as well. But from gross receipts, I would say that the most typical way that monies are divvied out is first they go to a collection agent, which we'll get into in our closing checklist call. I'm sure Zeb would want to see one as the attorney for the lenders. And then monies go to SAG residuals. They're typically right at the top if you're, SAG, WGA, etc. And then after that typically comes sales agents and distributor fees and expenses that they get to recoup. Any monies that the company spent in order to market and promote the film that wasn't investments, like let's say I as the manager just put some charges on my credit card in order to make the premiere.
Sean, I'm going to give you your next slide, by the way, because it's, oh wait, sorry.
No,
I'll go into it. I'm right. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah. So after that, once the company's recouped any expenses that it spent that weren't equity or weren't loans, then come debt financing comes right after sales agents and distributors. After that is typically equity. And we'll get more into what the typical terms are for an equity investment a little bit later. But they typically recoup after distributors and third-party sales agents. After that are typically bonuses and third-party payments, that like deferments that you had to make to cast and crew. And then normally we reach what is called net profits, which are the back-end points that everyone gives out on their film. In a typical equity finance project, the back end is split 50-50. 50% is retained by the manager. So let's say it was me and Zeb, we're the managers. We have 50% of the back end points that we can do with what we want. Normally, as per the operating agreement, it can say something different in the operating agreement as to what other approvals we need to have in order to give them out. But those are the points that are typically allocated to third-party cast, crew, the writer, directors, the composer, above the line crew, people like that are involved in the actual production of the picture. And normally it'll say that any points that are left over are retained by us managers, and we're going to split them 50-50. So like, let's say, we gave out 25 points of the back end to third parties, and then Zeb and I each get 12.5%. That's great. The other 50% is typically given out to equity investors on a pro rata pari passu basis, which means that whatever you're investing in the film itself, you're going to get a pro rata portion of the back end of 50% of the net profits. So I'm going to use really easy numbers here. And let's say the budget of the film is $1 million, straight up just $1 million. And Elsa gave $250,000 of it. So she gave 1/4 of the budget. So she's going to get 1/4 of that 50% back end interest that's reserved to investors. So 12.5% of the back end as well. It can get obviously a lot more complicated just because of the the math there that's involved, but that is the standard way that equity investment breakdown in the net profits works. So on this slide, the state of formation is important. As we discussed, addresses, resident agent, and then disclosure requirements as required by like the SEC and other state type licensing commissions, which is that we'll get into in a little bit. Will my LLC be member managed or manager managed? Like we said, with equity financing, manager managed is typically best. The reason being is that if we're member managed and we had 10 different people give equity contributions, and we, Zev and I have 50% interest of the LLC that we retain per our operating agreement, but now we have to, any decision that we make, whether it's creative, business, financial, we now have to go out to 10 other people and get all of their votes on it before we can move forward. And it just becomes a lot more of a headache. There's a lot more cooks in the kitchen. And normally in this situation, we're the producers, we want to be able to move fast and strike quick if the need arises. Like if we are going out to a lead actress and Zev and I retain creative controls, we don't want to go to 10 other people to say like, are you okay with Charlize Theron being the lead actress or not? Let's all have a vote, let's all put it in writing, and let's all hop on a Zoom to talk about it. It's a lot easier if there are just a few managers. I mean, normally you want to keep it less than 4, although for the most part, that's how it typically works out, just in terms of the producers. Again, once you start to reach, 5 or more, it starts to become a lot, too many cooks in the kitchen again. And then the other thing to note that I kind of touched on with Zev was if we have multiple managers, so both him and I are managers, how are we working out that tiebreaker? Is Zev more business oriented? Am I more of the creative decision maker, the creative producer, and Zev is the one that is handling all the equity investors and seeking financing, more the equity raising producer? If we have a disagreement, what will normally happen is that if there's 2 or an even number in our operating agreement, we're going to lay out, okay, in the event of a disagreement, Zev is going to be responsible and have the tiebreaker for business decisions, and me, Sean, will have the tiebreaker in terms of creative decisions, so that we each kind of share in that decision-making process in the event of disagreements. Some people will say, look, like Zev and I are very good friends and we're never going to disagree about anything, we're of one mind. And the number of people that have said that to me and then come back to me in a year and a half from now and say, look, Zev and I, we just couldn't decide, and now we can't decide on a distributor, and neither of us want to move forward with the other's distributor, and now we're at a standstill, and equity investors are banging down the door, asking us when we're going to exploit the film, and we can't agree on a distributor, we can't agree on a sales agent. My first question is, well, what does the operating agreement say? And their response is, it doesn't talk about it, just says we're the 2 managers. It happens, and Elsa and Zev can attest to it, all the time. So even if you are best friends now, it's always good to consider what the worst case scenarios are down the road. Inserting that tiebreaker, making sure that your operating agreement is strong, lists out everyone's approval rights, lists out what happens and what rights members have, what rights equity financiers have, because they're ultimately going to be passive members of that LLC. And the way that they become a member is by, 1, handing you a check with that money, and then signing either a term sheet or a subscription agreement, which is basically them saying like, look, I've reviewed the operating agreement, I agree with it, and I am giving you this check for X amount of dollars in exchange for becoming a member of that LLC for a certain portion of the back end, a recoupment position in the waterfall, etc. And I think that's everything I have, unless you have anything you want to add.
No, I think so. Now that Sean has walked you through how to set up the company, right? You are ready to go. You have your perfect operating agreement because Sean gave you all the great advice, and you now are out to the world and wanting to raise money, right? This is the point in which you have to ask yourself, what are the who, what, where, and whys of the equity investment in relation to your project and in general to understand how to think about it. So let's kind of look at each section, and we're going to focus this round on equity, and then we'll talk about debt once Zev kind of explains what that is to us. So who provides equity investments? Generally, more often than not, it's parents and immediate family, you know, a high net worth person who just believes in you, angel money, friends and family. You know, equity investments are wildly risky. You're asking someone to give you hundreds of thousands of dollars without a distributor generally in place, with the hope that you're going to be able to sell the completed film, or the film may get sold while it's in production. And as we all know, those are very risky. And obviously in today's marketplace and world, it's not even possible or probable to think about the construct of a film festival as a place to sell it per se. Like, we don't even know how that's all going to unfold itself. Oftentimes we deal with investors who are self-investing, and one of the caveats of that, I would say, is that you should remain disciplined even when it's your own money. I think sometimes people get, you know, I wouldn't say lazy, but I think are casual about spending their own money, and they don't put in all of the institutional aspects of equity investment, a proper operating agreement, proper work for hire agreements, and that can come back to haunt you, because you should treat it like you would as if you were to buy a house or anything else. It's high net worth individuals. There are a lot of fake finders in this town, as everybody knows, but there are also, you know, known executive producers that will kind of get behind and invest in and provide equity financing for an emerging artist, an interesting story, or something that really only can be made in the construct of an independently financed film. More so for documentaries than I would say for features, but that varies. There are grants and non-for-profit financiers. You know, there's Game Changer has grants that it offers. Sundance Institute does offer partial grants for features and unscripted docs, and there's a lot of actual federal grant programs that are available. So, you know, I think these ebb and flow throughout time. It's interesting. I haven't seen if they're on a downturn of availability with everything going on in the world, but it's certainly a way in which to finance. And then you have financing production companies. Those are kind of up and coming, either sort of, there's a high net worth individual that's funding the company, and they may come in and agree to provide equity financing on a picture, but may want to be maybe not necessarily a manager, but may want more approvals and controls because their point of view is that they've done it before. I've represented, you know, a handful of these companies that, you know, make a conscious choice to provide equity financing in 3 or 4 or 5 films a year. They're not 100% financing each film per se, but they are an equity financier. They're getting a pro rata portion of the back end. But I think with each passing film, they become a little bit more sophisticated about what their expectations are and what their role is. And, you know, in terms of where else equity investment comes from, it's frankly like wherever you can find it. It's a very hard thing to find. And, you know, you don't have collateral, you don't have anything in place. And so to the extent you can find someone willing to invest in your film, it's a great opportunity. And it ebbs and flows, you know, there is GoFundMe pages and things like that, but I would say that that is not necessarily, with a handful. I think Zach Braff may have got his film fully financed, and I worked on a client who had a Star Trek documentary that got fully financed through GoFundMe. But generally, those fill in the holes. They may help supplement development, but they're not necessarily going to get you to the finish line of how you can get a film made. Okay, so then what does the investor get? Sean did a really good job of explaining it in the context of the waterfall, but in a sort of centric way, the investor's like, well, I don't care about all these different things. Where do I fit into this construct, right? So generally speaking, at-risk equity, right? Money that's coming into the picture generally through the LLC, they get a fixed premium of their investment. The range is 10 to 20%. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more, but that's about right. And that return on investment of the 10 to 20% is a pro rata pari passu with other equity investors. Now, if it's fully financed by equity, they're kind of sitting ahead of all the profit participants after guilds and things like that. If there is debt financing, you have a tax credit lender, you have a debt financier, which Zeb will go into, then this equity generally almost always sits behind the debt financing. So they're getting a fixed premium of 20% of their money, but the lender ahead of them is getting usually a lower interest rate, but it's an accruing interest rate. So if that debt financier doesn't get paid for 1, 2, 3 years, that interest is accruing. The equity, on the other hand, just kind of sits there with a flat fixed premium. The exchange of that is they get a pro rata portion of 50%. So their upside is uncapped, but their their ability to recover is impacted, and they're not necessarily getting the value of their money, especially the longer it takes to repay them. The 50% of the net profits is kind of like the cookie cutter basic recipe. Like most equity finance deals, it's 50% to the creative pool, as Sean pointed out, to the producers, the actors, the managers kind of figure out who gets what of that. And then the equity financiers get 50%. When you start to introduce other financing sources, you as the producer need to take a step back and say, is it really appropriate for equity to get 50%? So if your debt is 50% of the budget, maybe your equity shouldn't be getting 50% of the back end. Maybe they should be getting 25 or 40 or 30. And it kind of depends on their risk profile and how you're utilizing them and at what point they come in. I've also had situations on documentaries where we figure out a formula where if my clients are able to supplement a significant portion of the budget through grants that are non-recoupable, that's to the benefit of the equity investors. And so conversely, we ask that some of the 50% back end gets reduced. So these are sort of things that you can't just take on face value. You have to think about it on a case-by-case basis. Credits, as any of you know, watching any sort of, I'm sure you guys have been Netflix binging since March, on all these independent movies, the list of executive producer and producer credits is exhausting. They're the cheapest thing you can give, right? So these credits are freely given. I think that you kind of need to make sure not to completely devalue the credits, so that, sometimes early on someone's giving you 10 or 20 or 30 grand and suddenly you've given them single card EP credits, multiply that by 30 investors. You can't really, it's silly for a movie, even on main on end, to have 30 single individual EP cards, right? So credits are generally executive producer. If they're the lion's share of the financing, 50% or more, definitely at 100%, the expectation then often will rise to a producer credit. Investors in equity financing for independent film have a little bit of motivation that are self-serving. So yeah, they want to go to the set, they want to go to premieres, and the details of that, you got to kind of figure out what they really care about. Debt financiers care less about that. Equity does. And then there may be other fees in the budget or the waterfall, and it just kind of depends. With equity financiers, you're trying not to add more fat into the budget and have to pay out producer fees and things like that. But oftentimes with equity financiers, you probably may be dealing with a conduit or someone that introduced the money and paying finder's fees or EP fees or things like that. They may want you to cover some legal fees. Usually for equity, it's not, but that's a discussion point. And then you have approval or consultation rights. And, I would say to err on the side of caution in anything that rises to the level of approval rights, unless it's a significant financier or a financier that has credibility in the history of what they've done. We just had a deal where the executive producer had a studio background, had been directly involved in selling, 3 Sundance movies back to back year by year. So when they were putting in not the lion's share of money, but wanted a little bit more of an involvement process in the sale process, we had to respect that and figure out a solution. But you got to be careful too, because what sometimes happens is, as a producer, you're motivated to close everybody, and you give approval and consultation rights to different investors, and suddenly you have contradicting obligations. Just like Sean's been on the phone where the people can't agree to a decision, I've been on the phone where my client did who knows what, and they asked me, oh, how do I make a decision about a festival spend? And there's 8 different financier agreements where they did 8 different arrangements. One guy can do up to 25, another guy has to be able to attend, and it's just it becomes very complicated. So you have to be careful to be disciplined, right? On one hand, you want to close the deal, but on the other hand, you always need to be thinking about the macro, because everything needs to kind of run together. Other things investor gets, I didn't want to put it in writing, but for those of you that have painfully been through maybe not so stellar equity experiences, their daughter may want a cameo. They may want to do a speaking role opposite the star of the movie. They may want to direct. You really have to be careful about the creative integrity of what you're making, and quite frankly, if you're selling your soul to the devil. So these things come up. These are considerations to make. Sometimes it's all effortless and wonderful, and sometimes it's a complete disaster. So now we know what is the investor getting. Where does the investment get placed? I'm going to just gloss over this because Sean did a great job of explaining it, but as we talked about, it's generally a limited liability company. The equity investor is almost always a passive member. There are instances where the investor has everything that we described in terms of terms, except they're not an actual member of the LLC. Instead, they just have a participation in the waterfall. They get their money back plus a return. They get a pro rata share of the back end, but they're not actually an equity owner of the LLC. Sometimes you have limited partnerships. When I first started practicing law, that's kind of what everyone was doing. And within the 3 years when I started, it all converted to limited liability company. I think a lot of it was tax driven. And that is what we call the single purpose entity. Almost always that entity that the investors are putting their equity in is the copyright owner of the picture. The asterisk to that, and it's something to vet if you're either the producer or the investor, is it that it's the copyright owner of the picture itself, and where do subsequent production and derivative rights lie? From an investor standpoint, you're going to want to know that in success of the film, if a scripted series, documentary, something else stems from the movie, you should at least have some sort of ability to get a rights fee that would get attributed to the LLC, and or the ability to finance in those subsequent productions. As the producer or the rights holder, you want to kind of hold on to those rights. So that's a negotiated point that we kind of figure out on a case-by-case basis. So why are investors motivated for equity? And you'll see this juxtaposed to the motivations under debt. It's very different, right? Usually it stems from the team. They believe that the producers, the director, the writer are the ones that are going to be able to have my big fat Greek wedding. They're going to be the ones that are going to make the next Saw. Like, they are going to be the ones that are going to really execute something that is going to be an outlier to the normal course of the depressing business of independent filmmaking, right? So it is always centered around who is making this movie. Sometimes it's cause related because of subject matter. I think, again, this skews more documentary. You know, we've had a lot of investors that are really motivated to tell diverse stories. Investors that really want to tell documentaries that bring light to things around PTSD or military issues or the government. And sometimes it's a little bit more, I wouldn't say propaganda, but more politically charged related subject matters, or faith-based, or things that they feel are important to them, and they're investing it and taking the risk because they believe that this type of story should be told. The endorsement of a financier that has a history of picking successful indie films, it's very easy to understand that motivation, because if you have an investor that's interested like that, you can look up their credits and see, well, you know, they've been able to successfully identify 6 movies in the past 2 years that have been at Cannes, Sundance, et cetera. And you kind of get to understand those reputations and understand who they are. And I think as a producer afforded the opportunity to work with someone that has done that and has been successful out of that, it's a great opportunity to have a mentor and an EP that is really going to be a value add as opposed to just money. But you have to be careful. But it is always important for you as the producer or the person putting this all together to be honest with what is the motivation of someone. Like, if it's to get a role in the movie, or why do they want to invest? And you have to really identify that, because there is papering the deal, but then there's navigating through the process that is the film. And if they say to you, you know, I'm a 40-year-old super rich dentist, but I always wanted to be on the set of a movie, and you know that, and it's not contractual, and you just take the money and run and don't really make an effort to bring them to set or keep them included, and after the fact you're in post-production and just kind of ignore them, that's not going to go well, and you're going to get scorned investors and unhappy investors. So you have to make a commitment to understand your investors' motivation. They are your partners, and you need to make sure to obligate yourself to satiate their motivation, and also steer away from motivations that you know will come back to haunt you. You know, if it's like just some skeezy guy who just wants to meet like young girls on set, I don't know that you would want to take their money, especially in the world that we live in today. So that's kind of a good overview of understanding the who, what, where, why of equity financing. So now let's talk about debt. And Zev, this is your twin, Tom Cruise. Here you go. I'm going to let Zev talk to you about what debt is, and then we're going to kind of go through the same summary of the who, what, where, why. So Zev, I'm going to go to the next slide if it's okay with you.
I'm ready for it. So we're now going to start talking about debt financing, and the key to debt financing is right there at the top, which is you cannot get debt financing without collateral. It just can't happen. And so what is collateral, you might be asking yourself, because I would like to get some debt financing so I can raise some more money to make my film. And so the number one thing that people often use are tax credits. Sean alluded to those earlier when he was talking about setting up the company. There are a number of states, most notably Georgia, people know about, Louisiana, New Mexico, New York, Puerto Rico. All of those states incentivize you to come and shoot your independent film in their locality. And what do they give you? They give you a percentage. It varies by state in terms of what they're going to be offering. Now, the way that process works is you go and you spend the money there and you apply for it, and then you get it back, at some point in the future. And depending on the state, it can be a while. So that doesn't help you necessarily, the person making that film today. You need that money now to make your movie. And so once you are in a state and are prepared to shoot there, and you can find the location that you want, and you have able to apply and qualify, you then can turn to tax credit lenders who will give you a portion of what they think your tax credit will ultimately be upfront, so that you have that money for your budget, so you can make your movie now. Another type of collateral are foreign pre-sales and estimates. So maybe you are a first-time producer and you know someone who is a sales agent, and they see a certain element of your movie, and they say, I think this has the real chance for success. And they take it out and they start selling to primarily, in this instance, foreign countries. They would sell them, they would secure deals with various territories overseas, and then based on the amounts of money, the minimum guarantees that those parties are willing to pay, you are able to then take those foreign pre-sales. Again, it's not necessarily full money in your bank account, but it is signed contracts, and you are able to take that to a different lender who then says, that looks good, I'm familiar with those foreign buyers, I will give you the money today with interest rates so that I can get that money at some point in the future. Again, another type of collateral is a domestic or a worldwide minimum guarantee. You find a US distributor or a North American distributor, let's say, who is very interested in your film and wants to give you $1 million, $2 million, $500,000 when you deliver the film to them. Again, that is money that can be relied upon, but you cannot use that today to make your movie. You're not going to get it till the movie's done. You take it to a financier who then says, great, I'm going to finance that. That is another way to do it. And again, a weak type of collateral, but still collateral in itself, is the picture itself. Now, you could be saying to yourself, this sounds great. How do I find these these foreign sales agents or these domestic distributors who are willing to give me these guaranteed monies for my film? There are a lot of different ways to do that, and also we'll get into a little bit of that as well. But A-list directors, A-list actors, a screenwriter who's had success, maybe even a producer who has a tremendous track record. All of those things can create value in your film that then allow you to get money guaranteed before you've made your movie, which you can then take to a debt financier who will give you money with some conditions, certainly, so that you can actually make your movie now with money in your pocket. I think you can go to the next slide, Elsa. So that's the big picture, but what are the types of debt? So the first type of debt and debt instrument is what's often called a bridge loan. You are gearing up to get going on this to make your movie, and maybe you're 30 or 60 days out and pre-production is really getting underway, and you've got to secure your lead actor by making a deposit, because CAA will not make that person available until money is in the bank account at the agency. And your big financier, let's say you have a senior financier, is really taking a long time. Oftentimes, what you can do is go and find what's called a bridge loan. That is a loan that you would take that sort of like the bullet point says, allows you to get going earlier and get money in your bank account, secure that talent, get your cast ready, get some of the locations set, and everything that you need to do. Those loans are generally considered maybe a little higher risk because not everything is in place. Maybe the movie won't happen. Maybe a pandemic will happen while that no one anticipates, and they're a little bit higher risk. And so generally speaking, with bridge loans, it's a type of debt instrument. You're looking oftentimes at a little bit of a higher interest rate because of the increased risk. The next type of loan that we would talk about is a tax credit loan. Again, you've gone to the state that offers the incentive. You want to get your tax credit in place. Every different state varies. Some states offer you a floor on the tax credit, meaning you'll get no less than this much on the dollar that you spend there, and other things of that nature. Again, one thing that we like to recommend to our clients is, and obviously not everybody has this luxury, but if you start early enough, is to shop your tax credit. There are a handful of tax credit lenders, and you should really go out there to make sure you are getting, the best interest rate and the best deal that you can get on your tax credit. Because again, the more money you secure and are able to get there, and the less interest you're having to pay, means more money to make your film a success, and hopefully make it profitable for yourself. One thing I always like to say to people is on this one, and we'll again get into this a little bit later, is watch out for default rates on these tax credit loans, especially in these sort of more uncertain times. Your timeline for getting these tax credits back from the state, which is how you repay the tax credit lender, right? They are secured by the incentive that will be paid out by that state. That process can take a little bit of time, and I'm actually, personal experience right now, seeing a couple deals where people and producers are having to come and, refinance their tax credits because, the timeline of their film got a little bit, adjusted by COVID or otherwise, and the default rates are so severe. They didn't even realize. They thought the tax credit would come in, pay off their tax credit lender. They wouldn't have to worry about it. And now, of course, they're realizing that the default is really going to cause a problem. And so they have to go and find another financier to come and refinance the tax credit loan. The most common loans that senior financiers put in are loans against minimum guarantees and or pre-sales. We talked about that, right? That's some money that a distributor is willing to pay upfront before your film is even finished. They're agreeing to that amount when you deliver the film to them. A financier will evaluate that risk and offer you money upfront so you can actually make your movie. Couple of things that I always like to tell people about, right, is they say to themselves when they're preparing their finance plan, I got $1 million guarantee. Boom, I've got $1 million to play with in my finance plan. Remember, obviously, financiers are in the business of making money. They're going to charge you interest, and they're not going to give you necessarily full credit on the amount that you come, right? They are not going to lend you necessarily $1 million just because you have $1 million guarantee. And, that is something that you should always keep in mind as you're building your finance plan, so that you make sure as we may get to on our finance call, there's always oftentimes a little bit of money missing to hit what's called the strike price. You have enough money to make your movie based on the budget you have painstakingly prepared. And, this is something that comes up when we are representing financiers all the time, and the money has to come from somewhere. And if you, as the producer, the better you plan, the less likely it is to come out of your producer fees, because that is always the first place that a financier will turn to when they're looking to make up a gap in the budget. The last type of debt is what's called a gap loan. That is, you have a foreign sales agent who is estimating they can make these types of sales based on the property and other elements that they like about it. A financier may make an entirely base gap loan, or they may be loaning against the existing pre-sales that have sort of guaranteed that certain foreign people will pay a certain price based on the elements in play. And then they'll say, okay, the estimates from the foreign sales agent are X. I will give you, again, some more money up front so you can make this movie based on those estimates. I think the sales agent will be able to achieve them, and I feel comfortable taking that risk. Again, remember, it's a discounted number, especially on gap loans. They're not going to be giving you full credit for these supposed estimates. Even with some track record, there's going to be a little bit of a discount on that, so you have to factor that into your finance plan. Next slide. Key terms and considerations when you're considering debt, and Elsa, I'll try not to step too much on your toes, are things to keep in mind, right, are the interest rates. That is the rate. Usually it's done on a per annum basis that you are going to pay for this money. So if it's going to take you a year and a half to deliver your film, you have to factor in that you're going to be paying that type of interest. And that's just the basic interest. Obviously, there's other things called default interest that we talked about. That is, you've missed the date to pay back the loan, and now you're paying even more interest. Interest rates, again, are lower generally on tax credits because states may be guaranteeing a portion of them, and higher on bridge loans and gap loans and things of that nature. Other things, again, that also we'll touch upon a little bit more later are other costs that lenders that you should be keeping your eyes open if this is your first time dealing with debt financing. Setup fees, your responsibility to pay the debt financier's legal fees, and what are called commitment fees. And those are all important because you may see a great interest rate on the loan, but when you add in all the fees between the setup fee and the commitment fees that you're paying to that lender and that debt financier, you may ultimately not be getting the great deal you thought you were getting. Again, the term of the loan, make sure that it fits within your timeline so that you can deliver the picture to the financier and to the distributor, so that they pay out their money to your financiers so that you are not paying default interest. And obviously in the worst case scenario, we already talked about default interest, but foreclosure, oftentimes, not even oftentimes, almost always, a financier is going to take a secured interest in your limited liability company, in the asset itself. And if you aren't able to repay ever, they may choose to foreclose and take over the project. And obviously, as the producer, that's a worst case scenario for you.
Great. So now understanding the basics of what debt is, right? Let's look at the who, what, where, why of a debt deal in relation to a film finance construct. And I'm going to just kind of pass through because Zev did a really good job of giving you guys an overview, and then we can kind of contextualize it with a closing call for the rest of this session. So who provides debt finance investments? Sometimes it'll be high net worth individuals. Frankly, it's often someone that got burned on equity and only really wants to invest moving forward where there's collateral in play. Zev represents a handful of these guys that definitely, took their licks on a bad equity deal and now are kind of only going to navigate in the entertainment world with risky film financing opportunities, but with some form of collateral in play. Sometimes it'll be a company that has a fund or non-institutional debt financing. So for tax credit and even sort of debt financing where they may take more of a risk than a bank, they are prevalent in the film finance world. You have companies like Bondit, who kind of does a little bit of everything, Forest Road Capital, which does a lot of tax credits, but like they, for example, will do some senior lending, 120DB. 3 Point Capital does a lot of tax credit lending. So they're not institutional banks, but they have the ability and the wherewithal to offer up debt financing. It's not their first time doing this type of transaction. They do several of these a year. And in that sense, you have a little bit of a streamlined process. They know what they're looking for. They have their list of due diligence items, and they're sort of a well-run machine, usually. You just want to make sure to do your due diligence on both of those first 2 points to make sure that you have vetted those persons or companies, make sure that they are viable, that they have the funding, that they've done this before. If they haven't done it before, how can you sort of verify that they say that they have the money that they do before they make you do an entire slew of things and then not come up with the cash, which has happened. And then there's like very traditional banks. So right now there's a brick wall issue with banks in the sense that banks almost always, I can't think of any exceptions, require a completion bond, which right now you cannot get. At least Zev is working on it, actually. So I'm going to put an asterisk that Zev may have figured out how you can get a bond. There are a few bond companies saying that they can do it. But there's a struggle with getting bonds right now because insurance is not covering COVID-related claims. So banks need not just the collateral and the security of the collateral, but the completion bond to ensure that the film can get delivered to a third party. And without the protection of COVID in that construct, there is a barrier right now. So the way that needle is being threaded right now is either there's someone that's personally guaranteeing overages related to COVID, or the network or studio is bearing some liability, but that's a TBD. So what does the investor get? I think Zev did a really good job of kind of explaining to you the different risk profiles. Obviously, tax credit is a little bit more linear. It's very easy to quantify the value of a tax credit earned. The interest rates can be lower. If it's GAAP, I think the sales agent is going to sell these things, the risk is much higher, and so the percentage attributed to it goes much higher. So the range really does depend from 8 to 25%, and you have to, as Zev mentioned, shop around, but also look at the fine print of the other variables of the cost of the loan, even down to who's handling the legal for them and what the legal costs are. You know, I've had situations where apples to apples, the deals look exactly alike, but when you look at the legal cost of one transaction, it's 150,000, and on the other transaction, it's 25,000. And therein lies, you know, the penalty to the producer who didn't do their due diligence on all aspects. Entitlements, default interest rate past the maturity date, as Zev mentioned, especially now in a COVID construct, lenders are taking a position that you're lucky to have me. We should have traditional maturity dates, and producers really need to take a hard look at the reality of the world that they're living in. And even in a transaction where you don't have a completion bond, you really need to be honest with yourself about what is a realistic maturity date. You know, if there's an outbreak in the middle of shooting and you guys have to stop and start up again, is the maturity date factoring that in? And is there a COVID related, you know, force majeure period? How are we resolving that factor right now? Usually non-institutional lenders or individuals that are taking more risk, right? It's not a traditional bank loan. They're agreeing to move forward without a bond. They're agreeing to lend against, you know, maybe a bank would lend 80% against the tax credit. Maybe the non-institutional lender is going to lend 92%, right? They're taking greater risk, therefore they want more upside. The back end varies. It's not a pro rata pari passu share of the 50%, rarely. It probably is more of like a finite amount of points in relation to what they're investing, but they'll also want credits. And some can be more egregious than others, and it just has to make sense for the overall deal. They may want varying approvals and consultation rights. The lender who is providing loan against your foreign pre-sales are going to want the right to approve if you change your sales agent. They're going to want the direct approval right with the sales agent for additional sales they enter into. They may want the ability to terminate your sales agent if they don't hit their numbers. So with collateral, there needs to be some checks and balances to ensure their collateral is protected. And so the approvals and consultation rights will corroborate with the collateral. So a tax credit lender, for example, is going to want to have approval over who's going to do your accounting. They're going to maybe want power of attorney to make sure that they're submitting or working alongside you to submit to the state for the tax credits. They may want the right to take over. So these are things that are negotiated and dealt with on a collateral to debt basis. Then you have to look at the fine print. The legal fees, financing fees, commitment fees are all above the interest, and those can vary from company to company, and you really need to look at the totality of the cost of the loan and not get stuck in just what you perceive to be the interest and that being the only cost. So then where does the investment get placed? It's back to kind of equity. This is where there is overlap. It usually goes into the LLC. Sometimes what may happen is, for example, in Louisiana, you generally will have a entity set there that will be the production entity. That entity actually will not own anything. It will be under a PSA or production service agreement with another entity in Louisiana that will be the copyright owner of which all the investors are providing the investments in. And in that situation, you know, the tax credit lender is going to take security in both entities because both entities now have different collateral elements. It's hard to explain it without a whiteboard because I feel like when I first started, I would need to draw that out. But basically, any company that touches in the production or the exploitation aspects will likely need to get some sort of security lien on them, depending on what the debt financier is lending against. So why are debt financiers motivated? You know, there's less speaking roles and red carpet agendas, but there is some of that, especially on the high net worth individual side. But debt financing is motivated by collateral, and it's collateral that can be verified and deemed bankable. The weaker the collateral, right? It's almost like a sliding scale. The weaker the collateral, the more risk. The motivations slowly start to feel and look a little bit more like equity. Because if someone is lending against the picture itself, as Zev pointed out, that's not that great of collateral, right? Like, what are they going to do? Foreclose and sell the picture? They don't have any tax credits. They don't have any pre-sales. Really, the only difference between them and equity is this right of foreclosure. So their motivations are going to probably be a little bit more akin to an equity financier. So you have to kind of understand the devil that you're dealing with and what the motivations are, and how do you really ensure from the beginning you're setting yourself up to have a collateral package and or affiliating with investors that have motivations that are going to align with your ultimate sort of goals and agendas. So I think we said a mouthful, but now without any further ado, I'm going to kind of contextualize it. How are we doing on time? Okay, this is perfect. The only thing I'm trying to figure out, Amanda, is how do I see everybody again on my...
Yeah, we can go ahead and have you stop sharing your screen. So go ahead and you can escape out of your PDF and then pull back up your control panel.
Is there a way to keep my screen so everyone can see the closing checklist, but see you guys again?
Yeah, you know what, there might be an option. If you go up towards your top of the screen under webcams, it could be, you might be able to see bring all webcams to front.
Hold on, I'm gonna try. Give me 1 second. If I can't figure it out, I'll give it. Okay, I'm not gonna make everybody wait. Let's just get into it. I'll just, and you guys can still see the screen, right?
Yeah, we can see the screen.
Okay.
And Sean and Zev, we can all see Sean and Zev too.
Great.
Well, it's kind of like the anticipation for a big closing call too. It's the nerves and the waiting.
Yeah. So here's what we're gonna do. We're just gonna get into the call, but here's everybody's roles, right? So raise your hand. I'm Elsa. I'm gonna be the mediator. Generally, closing calls do not have a mediator, but what I'm gonna be is sort of I'm helping out the producer borrower close and kind of helping with the equity, but just going to facilitate the call. So there's not usually that rational of a person on the phone without an agenda, but here we go. Sean is going to represent the producer who's ultimately the borrower, right, on the loan. And Zev is going to represent the senior lender. So the closing checklist that we're about to go into is Zev's, right? Like Zev generated it. He's telling Sean, here's all the stuff I need if you want my money. And this is our first call to discuss it. Okay, so without any further ado, you guys ready?
I am.
Great.
Ready.
Great. Okay, perfect. Okay, hi guys. Is everybody on?
I'm here.
Okay, great. Can everybody just tell us who you are and who you represent?
Sure, I'm the producer of this film. Look, we got the hottest director, hottest writer out of Sundance. They're burning hot. We got their next script. You know, it's gonna blow the world apart.
And Sean, do you have an attorney on the phone?
He's listening.
Okay. And he's going to be helping you with this closing.
Yeah, he's not engaged yet. We just got into this.
Okay. Okay. But you're having a lawyer help you.
I will. Great.
Okay. Go ahead, Zev.
This is Zev Rabin. I represent ABC Lender. We are going to be lending you some money on account of apparently this hot director out of Sundance.
Great. So Sean, do you want to just kind of walk us through budget, start date, guilds, like what's kind of the basics?
Sure. Yeah, so like our budget's going to be around $2 million. We're looking to start shooting in the next 5 weeks. We've already commenced with SAG as we, as everyone on this call knows right now, in order to get SAG clearance, there's a lot more protocols that you have to kind of reveal to them. So we, my dad just happens to be an epidemiologist, and I have a couple friends that are shooting as well. So I borrowed some other producers' kind of COVID protocols. I've had my dad review them, and I've sent them over to SAG. SAG seems content, but they have their own epidemiologist right now, and they're looking over our protocols. But all the other paperwork so far is in order with SAG, and we're looking like we're going to become a signatory relatively soon. Nothing should be holding that back.
And have they given you any sense, Sean, this is Lenders Council again, of the amounts that they're going to be seeking for their bonds? As the $2 million budget, I just want to make sure we've got that part factored in as well on your end.
They have not yet. So we're like, if for the bond, we have some friends and family equity that we're going to be able to utilize to cover the bond and maybe, escrow for a lead actor who we're out to right now.
And Sean, you said your lawyer's on the line. So when we prepare this first suite of documents and everything here, your lawyer will be able to do that. And are you able to provide, in advance of that, what the status is on the chain of title, so that we can
Yeah,
get
so
that review going?
yeah, it's an option purchase agreement. We currently hold the option on the screenplay, and we use some of our equity financing for that option. The actual purchase price is a little more than our equity would provide for. So, ideally, once we close this loan, out of the first payment would be the purchase price closer to the starter principal.
And when does your option go until?
It goes till 2022. We got a really long one. It's perfect.
Okay, great. And are you using equity to cash flow you? How long is that going to last you? Because Zev, do you feel like it's realistic to close in 5 weeks from your standpoint?
I'm glad to hear that the chain of title is going to be clear, but obviously the guilds and the other protocols that we also are going to be doing our own independent vetting of your protocols. I know you said you submitted those to SAG. We'd like to see those materials as well. Obviously, in this day and age, as the person putting the money at risk, we are also taking a look at all the protocols that producers are putting in place to make sure that they satisfy, our standards and our underwriters' standards. My client's underwriter standards, I should say, obligations for putting money at play in this environment.
Yeah, so we're shooting in Georgia. We rented out like a Motel 6. We're like 3 hours outside Atlanta. My dad, the epidemiologist, has a private plane, so we're able to fly in our actors direct from LA. The plan is for everyone to quarantine out there for 2 weeks before. And SAG's really loving this idea. It's pretty cheap to rent the hotel right now.
I mean, you're saving money on the Motel 6, but who's covering the costs on the private jet for all these various trips?
It's a tax.
Is that in the budget?
It's not in the budget.
Personal. Okay.
Personal
Just
use.
making sure.
Personal use.
Great.
But no, so we're shooting in Georgia, and so we have a tax credit lender already set up in Georgia. We shopped it around based on this great panel that I heard once, and we got a great deal. And then that tax credit lender is also, they kind of have a package deal. They're also rendering accounting services for the picture for post-production. So it's all kind of under one roof. I'm
Great.
sure you want to touch base with them, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, let me know who that is. Hopefully it's someone we've worked with, because obviously we're going to have to, if they're already in play, they may have already filed security that we're going to need them to subordinate to our security. So hopefully it's someone we've worked with before, and we're able to either have them limit their security to the tax credit only. And if they're not willing to do that, obviously, then we might have a problem. But hopefully it's someone we've worked with before and have an easy agreement that we can utilize to enter into with them.
Okay, pause. I just want to explain a couple working things. So generally when there's a tax credit lender as well as a senior lender, they both want their collateral, right? Usually the tax credit lender gets a perfected first position lien on the tax credit collateral, right? So that's like the tax credit rebate or credit that's coming in. And the senior lender, who's Zev in this instance, would get first position on the collateral of the film, the pre-sales, and sort of everything else. But they have to relate to one another. And by subordination, they basically will enter into a tri-party agreement with Sean's company, the producer borrower, the tax credit lender, and the senior lender that says, when it comes to tax credit proceeds, it goes first to the tax credit lender. When it comes to gross receipts of the film, it first goes to the senior lender. And what Zev is flagging is that even with the intercreditor into play, what could impact the timing of the closing is whoever actually files first is first to file, which is a right. And so until you have that intercreditor in place that clarifies that, that would hold up closing, because Zev is not going to lend if somebody filed security ahead of them without the intercreditor in place to restate his position. Right, Zev?
That is correct.
Yep. Okay. So all right, Sean, so your equity is helping you put in the money. And I guess before, Zev, you run down kind of the list of docs, your first suite of documents, which is on this page, I understand that you guys are making this in Georgia without a completion bond and with insurance not covering COVID. So I guess, Zev, can you walk me through what the lender needs? And Sean, can you just confirm that you can handle all of that? That's sort of COVID specific.
Sure.
Yeah, so obviously, if on the next call, Sean, if you have someone from your accounting team on, because we're going to really need to crunch the numbers and talk about this, because we're obviously going to be tranche funding, even as the senior lender on this budget, given the fact that there is no bond in place. We're going to be giving you the money as production goes along. Obviously, that mitigates our risk in case of a shutdown because of COVID, but obviously, we need to make sure that we're not trying to, be punitive about it, but we need to have your accounting team on so that we can make sure that our tranche funding requirements meet with the production cash flow requirements, for this production. That's one of the things we're going to need.
Can come in.
At this point, if we're 5 weeks out, we're going to be up against it to close on time. We've got to do a pretty serious internal review of your procedures. The first tranche, from our point of view, probably isn't going to be released until a few days before principal starts. And with respect to insurance, obviously, I hope you've gotten that process started. We've been having a number of issues, COVID exclusions or not. We've been hearing it's taking a long time, and obviously we're going to need additional insured certificates in place for us prior to any tranches being released. So to the extent you haven't started the process with that insurance company, I would, just like SAG, and make sure you've really gotten that going ahead of time, or else that's going to be an impediment to our funding. COVID exclusions or not.
Sure. So I guess we've already started the insurance, but I guess what you're saying is I'm not going to be able to have my money until right before principal, which is probably going to be a problem with, all of the above the line crew and cast that wants to be, obviously everyone wants to be escrowed right now because of the, they're unsure if things are actually going to go off, if production is going to run out of money, if production is going to get shut down in the middle of COVID. Above the line crew have already started hiring people to start doing some pre-production work. I got to pay the hotel. If I were to, I have a high net worth individual, in my back pocket. If I were to get a bridge loan from that person, how would that fit into your structure?
Sounds like you're going to definitely need to get that bridge loan in place, and so long as it fits within the finance plan and their fees are in place, ideally, if you can keep them from filing security, that's better from our point of view. But if you can't, obviously, similar to the tax credit lender, we just need to make sure we have an agreement that they will, a payoff agreement with them, that when they receive the money from the first tranche that we fund, that they release whatever security they may or may not be taking. But it's possible. And in fact, I'm sure you're probably going to need it because, again, we've got a lot of internal reviews that we need to do in this COVID environment, and you're really not going to get this first tranche until, like I said, a few days before principal photography starts.
And there's another problem in that, Sean, your tax credit lender said they want it to be last Monday. So Zev, will your lender sign off on that, your client?
It depends on who the tax credit lender is. If we have a good working relationship with them, we could be okay with that.
Okay, so Sean, you should look into that and let Zev know.
Well, definitely, I'll email to you.
Great. Okay, so the tranche of documents that Zev is going to send, I'm just going to kind of skip through so we can get to some other stuff. So he's going to send, you guys can see here, the loan document, the borrowing certificate, the notice of insurer, chain of title is just the option purchase that Sean said that they had, and then whatever distribution agreements are in place. Sean, are there, Zev, are you lending against actual closed distribution agreements?
I believe there's both a domestic distributor who's putting up a substantial MG and a foreign sales agent who I heard is not on the call. Obviously, Sean, for the future calls, we really need them to be on these calls so we know the current state of affairs with their sales and what their requirements are. We can sort of deal with them at the top of each call so they don't feel like they need to be on for all of our back and forth, but they really need to be on these calls on a going forward basis, because if I'm lending against their secured pre-sales, which I have been led to believe and been told that I am, we're obviously going to want them on these calls as well going forward.
And Zev, do you have the signed agreements, or do you need Sean to facilitate that and contacts?
I have the signed SAA. I'd like to start seeing the short term, the deal memos or NOAs with respect to some of those foreign sales agreements that may have already been pre-sold. And we're also going to need to, with your distributor, enter into an agreement with them to ensure that the payment goes directly to us as well. An
Okay.
inter-party agreement with them, or a direction
And
to pay.
And it's the middle of August, so on the foreign pre-sales, that's almost impossible to get in 5 weeks because you got to have the guy in Germany sign a direction to, or a notice of assignment to pay the lender directly. So Sean, you got to tell your sales agent to kind of
I'll tell them to
get
pick up
going
the
here.
ball, get rolling.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so that's the distribution agreements. The note is just a short form version of the loan and security agreement. Borrowing cert power of attorney gives Zev's client the right to kind of take over and do things on behalf of the borrower if they're misbehaving. Then you have the security agreements. It's a UCC financing statement, so that's a filing that's done state by state. Copyright mortgage and assignment is filed with the Copyright Office. And then you have, we talked about some of these agreements. So there's the UCC searches, but Sean, you mentioned that the tax credit lender may have already filed. So Zev, I guess you'll find out if anything else is filed.
Yeah, I'm glad that Sean was upfront. We saw that when we did our search, so we're going to just need to address that when we get there.
So I
And
have to
then-
run new searches, or I just give you the same ones that the tax credit lender used?
I ran the UCC searches already in advance of this, but that's the only things I've done. We're going to need still certificates of good standing and other things that we're going to get to. Those will still be on your plate to provide, but we did run that search.
Okay, I'm gonna, we talked about the intercreditor agreement with the tax credit lender. Obviously with SAG, Sean, just take note that if they sign the security agreement ahead of the lender, you're gonna need that interparty before closing with SAG directly.
Yeah, we already did that, so.
Just adding more work to your plate.
Make sure you get the.
I don't know.
I'm just going to run through because I know we only have 10 minutes left, although we could go all day, but just for everybody else in terms of the rest of it, Sean's whole story about his gangbusters director writer took us for a loop. So Sean will also provide chain of title documents. In his case, he mentioned it's pretty simple. It's an option purchase. It doesn't seem like there's underlying rights, proofs of payment, et cetera, will all be provided. Then other third-party agreements. So the escrow agreement, what Zeb was mentioning, that they would fund in tranches. What may happen is that between the tax credit lender and the debt financier, they may all fund it in escrow and then draw down per mutually agreed upon schedule. The deposit account control agreement is something that Zev's client will have on the production bank account just to make sure that they have control of the money if things go awry. And then the collection account management agreement is where the waterfall is memorialized among all the parties. Generally, Zev's client would get paid first, not outside of the CAM, and then everybody else is paid in the collection account thereafter. The production documents, you can see these are all very sort of standard things that are needed for closing, whether it's equity or debt. So budget, screenplay, cash flow, et cetera. These would all be on Sean's plate and his silent attorney. And then insurance here, as we mentioned, we don't necessarily have a bond company, but there would be E&O insurance and regular general policy. And, you know, in this fictional account of it, there was a little bit of willingness to just allow for exclusions. It's usually not that simple. Right now with COVID, someone's going to have to bear that liability. And then you have the borrower formation documents. That's all the stuff we went through with Sean. It's the certificate, resolutions are drafted to allow for the loan, the certificate of formation, operating agreement. So you guys can see that the stuff you started with, you're ultimately going to have to send to Zev and have him approve it. So it has to look on the up and up. And then what Zev had mentioned in the beginning are directions to pay from each of the distributors. So those are things that Zev will usually draft the NOA, but then the actual distribution agreements are provided by the borrower, and then you'll involve the sales agent and domestic distributor counsel as and when needed. And then these are kind of additional documents that may come into play. You know, you can see bridge here is 48, 46 is tax credit loan agreements. This is all sort of customized to what your actual financial structure is. And those are all on the borrower. It's really just for Zev to review and approve it. And that is a very abridged version of a closing call, but gives you a sense of the many, many facets of trying to get something closed, even when it's a $2 million loan. So Amanda, I know, you know, I can go over a little bit just so that we don't, you know, I have about 10 to 15 minutes. I know, Sean, you have to jump off, but we're happy to answer any questions. that anyone has.
All right, excellent. And Elsa, you know what I'll do is I'll have you stop sharing your screen. So if you
Great.
want to escape and click on the control panel, and under sharing, you'll just click stop sharing screen. All right, guys, so that was a blast, and I hope that the really hot Sundance director does extremely well on this film. All right. So we'll get to as many questions as we can, because I know you guys are a little pressed for time. Prima would like to know, earlier when you guys were talking about the corporation formation, she wanted to know if there's any advantage to registering in Delaware and why.
I can take that. Generally, people will want to form in Delaware because they've heard it's a place to form entities, and there are certain taxable benefits that you receive as a Delaware entity as opposed to forming California. California has a pretty high minimum tax that you have to pay every year for entities. The disadvantage of forming in Delaware is there's not a lot of film production in Delaware. So even if I form in Delaware, but I'm shooting my film, like let's say in Colorado, I can take a risk and operate under that LLC, that Delaware LLC in Colorado for my entire film. However, if there's a claim that's made against me and that lawsuit's filed in Colorado, the first thing the court will likely say is, well, this is a Delaware LLC, but you shot a whole film in Colorado. You contracted all these Colorado employees in Colorado. Why is this a Delaware entity? It has to be a Colorado entity. So at the end of the day, even if you filed in Delaware, you'd more than likely have to file or register that entity in whatever state you were shooting in as well. That's it generally. There are certain caveats, like in New York, the tax credit has to be a corporation. So some people will file an LLC in Delaware that contracts with the New York entity that's a corporation in order to shoot in New York and get a tax credit, and then dissolve the entity in New York, and the Delaware LLC owns the copyright into the picture. But generally, you want to form the entity in the state that you're actually going to be shooting.
All right, guys, I've got a few questions here about Section 181. Is that back, and can you guys talk about that?
I know every year it changes a little bit. I think as of 2019 taxes, there's still elements to 181 that can be utilized. The one thing that I've run up against, and we usually will work with a tax advisor if clients are trying to take advantage of that, is that it only is applicable to the same category of income. And so how Sean pointed out that there are passive members that are investors, in that sense, any revenue generated or tax credit earned right from the 181 would only apply to other passive investments that you have, as opposed to active companies or active income you're earning. So it really has benefited a lot of people that were in real estate that needed to write off significant losses between their entertainment sort of investments and their real estate investment. But I don't know the 2020 state of affairs. Although with this pandemic, I would assume it's going to probably be business as usual.
Right, awesome. Lori has a question here. She says, hi, Elsa and team. Thank you for being here. She says, I'm a Ramo client. Erica does my legal work, and Tiffany has been tremendous connector for my projects. She said, my question is in regard to the operating agreement. How does that differ from a co-production agreement? We have a co-production agreement and are about to set up the LLC.
Well, a co-production agreement is generally between the producers and a third party, whether that third party is another production company, a financier, another set of producers. So it's governing between, it typically is governing between the production entity and a third party, whereas the operating agreement is governing the actual production LLC itself as very base level.
And I would say that, like, just knowing Erica, just because she and I do it, sometimes what'll happen is the parties that are all coming together are about to form or about to bring in investors, and and we've done this before, and Sean has too, sometimes you'll have a co-production among 5 parties. And then when an equity investor comes in, you set up the LLC, and sometimes the management provision that Sean was talking about, like who has tiebreaker, who has these things, you literally incorporate by reference. hey, how we all operate with each other is going to be managed by the co-production agreement. That's where all of our credits are. That's where all of our things are. But then the LLC is more about the, as Sean pointed out, the constitution of the managers and members only. So sometimes it's a 1-2 and they can reference each other, and sometimes it is because there's external factors in the co-production.
All right, awesome. Becca's got a question here, and she says, I have a production company entity formed in Chicago, but my next film will be filmed entirely in the UK. So this entity will be set up as a corp in the UK. I'm having trouble finding US counsel that is familiar internationally. How important is that, or can I continue with my Chicago-based entertainment attorney?
My opinion is that you want somebody local in the UK to at least make sure that the formation, the copyright, and just like the structure around your UK entity is right and not an issue. I think we're oftentimes US counsel to a foreign production, but I always stress that local counsel should be used to make sure that, you know, in the entity, you're not doing something that's going to get you sued there, or it's going to give you exposure or liability. There are a lot of amazing production focused attorneys out of the UK. We work with Lee and Thompson quite a bit. They're like, I call them my brother from another mother, because they're very similar to what we do. They just really focus on UK level productions. But I definitely think it's worthwhile to engage local counsel, even if you're still using your Chicago counsel for your deal and the above the line deals. You just want someone on the ground to make sure you're not making any mistakes.
All right, guys, I know there's a bunch more questions here, but I know we have to leave for time. Carl would like to know, could you please comment on fiscal sponsorship programs?
I will say that they're extremely helpful. I mean, those fall more on the way of documentaries, but it's a way for you to affiliate with a nonprofit that's already set up. They're a 501c3, and instead of a GoFundMe where the person is just giving you money without any expectation of a return, under a fiscal sponsorship, they're able to deem it a donation, and then the fiscal sponsor will generally give you those proceeds less a small nominal fee. Film Independent for many, many years had a pretty viable program. I don't know where they've been in the past 2 years. I just haven't seen them come across my desk, but they may still be active. And there are a handful in LA and New York and in San Francisco as well. So it's a great way for you where an investor is not necessarily compelled to do at-risk equity, but likes the idea of having the write-off, that they then would do it through a fiscal sponsor.
All right, and then actually the final question here from Adam says, is there any significant difference between entity formation for a film versus a television series versus a web series?
I'll take that. Generally, in terms of like an independent film, the producers are going to be forming that. With television, it typically is governed more by who your network or distributor is going to be. They might have their own protocols for how a TV entity is going to be set up.
All right, excellent. All right, guys, so I'm going to end it there because I know you guys have to hop off, but I do want, Sean, I know you have an immediate call right now. I do want to have all three of you provide a resource for everybody that's listening in today. So Sean, why don't I start with you, and then you can hop off.
I'll hold mine up. I think I gave you the name, The Insider's Guide to Film Finance, literally Bible of what we're talking about here. If you want to go, it's pretty thin. If you want to go more in depth onto any of the kind of topics that we talked about today, that's definitely the book to do it. It has, not templates that you would want to use necessarily with like your loan documents and equity documents, but it gives you, truncated templates so that you can kind of get an understanding and a feel for the language, and goes into all these different types of financing that we discussed today.
One thing I would recommend that people take a look at, obviously, when you're selling equity, it can oftentimes be deemed what's called a security, and there are rules in our great country about people who sell securities, and there's a very helpful SEC website page that sort of can walk you through making sure that you're doing what you need to be what's called exempt, right? You don't want, when you're making your small independent film, to have to go through quite the registration process with the SEC. The cost alone would be more than your budget. So this sort of is a user-friendly website that you can take a look at to make sure you're not, running afoul of some of those rules when you're offering your equity interests in your film to individuals.
All right, excellent. And Elsa?
I'm a big fan of a resource of California Lawyers for the Arts. They have a mediation program, a great referral program, also some pro bono, especially if you're just getting started. And they also offer educational programs as well. So I think it's just a great place to either align or find someone who's knowledgeable to help you, or when you're just starting out, maybe get a little bit of free help if you're emerging and just trying to get your bearings.
All right, excellent. You guys, I just put all of the links in the chat box, and if you guys are watching this on demand, I'll put them in a resource sheet underneath the video. And a lot of you guys were asking if you could get the information on the presentation. You'll be able to see that in the on-demand version. And then Elsa, are you okay with us sharing the PDF for this?
No, please do. Yeah.
Okay, so you'll have
Yeah.
that as a download. And then you guys, Elsa is president of packaging and sales, is on stage 32, Tiffany Boyle. So I'll put her contact information in the chat box as well. So if you guys want to try and get in touch with anybody at Ramo, you can certainly reach out to Tiffany on stage 32 and she can put you in touch. All right, well, you guys, thank you so much for being here today, and I appreciate your time. I know how busy the three of you are. And the comments coming in are everybody are saying thank you, that this was so helpful. This was brilliant. You guys were amazing. Thank you. So on behalf of all of us here at Stage 32, you guys, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. We
Thank you.
appreciate it.
All right, everyone, have a great day. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.